So Halloween has come around once again, which is as good of a time as any to sit down, turn the lights out and play some horror games. But what ones to play? Maybe Silent Hill, the original Resident Evil, or perhaps something more modern like Dead Space. Now, I love all those three examples, but what do they all have in common, besides the fact they're all awesome? Yep, they were never originally released on a Nintendo console. And to be honest, horror isn't the first genre you necessarily think of when you hear Nintendo, and yet there have been plenty of great standout examples. So I figured I'd list my top 10 favourite modern horror titles on a Nintendo system. But just some ground rules before we get started. Firstly, it doesn't have to be an exclusive, but it does have to have a Western release. Secondly, I'm ranking these by order of how great they are as games, not by how scary they might be. And lastly, by modern I mean anything from this millennium, so the likes of Doom and Castlevania are out. Why? Because it's my list and that's just what I fancy doing. So turn the lights off, sit back and let's get started. Number 10, Obscure 2. Also known as Obscure the Aftermath in North America, Obscure 2 originally came to the Wii and other systems in 2007, even though it looks like an early Dreamcast title. The CGI cutscenes look awful, the voice acting is terrible, and the friendly AI is dumb. Like, really dumb. Yet despite all that, Obscure 2 is like the video game equivalent of a cheesy teen horror flick in all the right ways. You play as a small group of university students as they survive the outbreak of some flower drug that's turned everyone else into bloodthirsty mutants. It's really cool how you add new survivors to your group as you progress through the story, each having their own unique abilities, like being able to push large objects, jump really high, or pick in locked doors. However, you can only go around with 2 characters at a time, so it adds a nice element of strategy on deciding who to take along on your trek. The reason why it's only 2 is because this game actually has drop-in, drop-out co-op, and I strongly recommend playing with a friend if you have the choice because, as I mentioned earlier, your partner's AI is incredibly dumb, and can end up getting themselves killed as they just blindly rush at enemies. Much like Resident Evil 5, the game is far more enjoyable this way. Unlike RE5, however, Obscure 2 can be at times rather scary. Having the occasional fixed camera angle creates some uneasiness in the player, not to mention the deliberately clunky combat makes you want to only fight the enemies as a last resort. Oh, and the save points are these giant flowers that make the character pass out on the floor with an ear-shattering screech every time you save, which is strangely unsettling. Obscure 2 is far from perfect, but if you're looking for a cheesy co-op horror game, then you could do far worse than this forgotten gem. Number 9, Dead Space Extraction. The Wii might not have gotten a proper third-person Dead Space game, but it did however get an on-rail shooter with the futuristic horror series in 2009. Set before the original Dead Space, Extraction recalls the events of how the necromorph outbreak is caused on the planet Aegis 7. Even though Extraction is primarily a linear guided shooter, it isn't just a monster shooting gallery, as it has plenty of slow intense build-ups, with moments that are genuinely terrifying. True to the series, Extraction never cuts away from the game to deliver exposition and dialogue. It's all told whilst you're still in first person, which really adds to the game's player immersion. Sometimes the camera can be a little nauseating with it moving around so much, but more often than not, it just reinforces the sense of urgency. The game can also be played on local co-op, which is pretty standard for an on-rail shooter, but it doesn't add any story significance. They're basically just another pointer on screen. I'll be honest, I strongly believe Dead Space Extraction has the best story and most memorable characters in the entire series. Sure, the gameplay itself isn't the most varied, even for this style of game, but its story and scenarios are definitely worth the price of admission, which is apparently really cheap these days. Number 8, Killer 7. From one on-rail shooter to another, except Killer 7 is one of the most unconventional rail shooters ever made. Heck, it's probably one of the most unconventional games ever made, period. Developed by Suda51 before he found wider fame with the likes of No More Heroes and Lollipop Chainsaw, Killer 7 was released on the GameCube and PS2 in 2005, and sees you take control of one of 7 different elite assassins, as they take down a terrorist organisation known as the Heaven Smiles, which just so happen to be invisible zombie creatures that explode on contact. The catch being that the 7 hired assassins are all physical manifestations of a wheelchair-bound old man and his split personalities, who also wields a giant-ass sniper rifle. Yeah, it's pretty fucking weird, and that's not the only unconventional part of this game, as controlling it is almost as hard to wrap your head around. It plays like a cross between an adventure game and a rail shooter, so you'll be picking up objects and solving puzzles in third person, but at any time you can switch to first person and scan the environment and shoot the aforementioned Heaven Smiles, as their blood is this game's currency that you use to level up each one of the 7 assassins' abilities. So as you would expect, this game is filled with plenty of the red stuff. Oh, and the whole game is played on rails too, where you simply hold the A button to move forward in third person. The lack of free-flowing control can be a little jarring at first, but you'll soon learn that this limitation only adds to the gameplay's claustrophobic nature. Running down a corridor and hearing that piercing laugh from the Heaven Smiles still sends shivers up my spine today. It may not be the most conventional of horror games, but that's just because it's not a conventional game at all. Number 7, ZombiU. Released in 2012 as a Wii U launch exclusive, ZombiU had a lot to prove at the time. Not only was this another zombie apocalypse game, but this was supposedly Nintendo's big push to bring in third-party, quote-unquote, hardcore games. And while we now know how the latter fed out unfortunately, but ZombiU was and still is much more than just another generic zombie killing simulator. The unique aspect of ZombiU is that one bite from the infected will end your character permanently, meaning all weapons and supplies can only be retrieved by tracking down your walking corpse and killing it with another character. This gets incredibly tense in the later stages of the game, as you'll find yourself up against multiple zombies far away from the nearest save point. Let your guard down even for a minute and a single zombie can end you. The dark and moody atmosphere of an abandoned London is often terrifying on its own, and that's without the fear of being eaten at any moment. As a result, it makes killing every zombie a satisfying ordeal. Throwing a flare towards a landmine and watching a crowd of them light up will never get tiring. Sure, the melee combat can become quickly monotonous, but I feel this only adds to the overall dread of wanting to avoid confrontation at all costs. The game was later ported to Xbox and PS4 last year, and while that version had an improved frame rate, it lost a lot of the original's charm without the unique uses of the Wii U's gamepad, as well as the lack of the overlooked multiplayer mode. It's a crying shame that because it massively undersold, it's highly unlikely that we'll ever get a sequel, because ZombiU as a series has a lot of potential. And if Assassin's Creed, Watch Dogs and Red Steel have taught us anything, Ubisoft know how to make a great sequel. Number 6, House of the Dead Overkill. Yet again we have another on-rail shooter, but this is the game to end all on-rail shooters. Why? Well, because Overkill is probably the best playing one out there. This game embraces the over-the-top gore to such an extent that just blasting every zombie is such a satisfyingly bloody mess. Upgrading each weapon the more you play only adds to the overall replay value too, and before you know it, every enemy is just painting the walls red, as they explode into a mess of limbs with every shot. It helps too that the levels and bosses are incredibly memorable and fun to play. There's the stereotypical hospital level where a ring-like girl stalks you throughout the halls, ending with a fight that is actually somewhat creepy. But my favourite is the carnival level where you mow down zombie clowns, ride an actual ghost train where the zombies hilariously stand around like cardboard cutouts, and finish it off by fighting a conjoined mutant twin named Nigel and Sebastian. Oh, and also you go through an arcade complete with Space Harrier and Ghost Squad machines. So yeah, if it wasn't already obvious, this game has so much fun with its premise and doesn't take itself seriously whatsoever. Unfortunately, the game doesn't run the smoothest, resulting in broken combos as it tries to keep a steady frame rate, but that's probably the only negative. And even then, that almost adds to its grimy film. It still baffles me that Sega haven't followed up on this Wii classic with a sequel. Sure, we did get the brilliant Typing of the Dead Overkill on PC, but we've been left hanging for a new Gorgasm fix ever since. Number 5, Project Zero 2 Wii Edition. Also known as Fatal Frame in the US, the original PS2 version from 2003 was remade from the ground up for the Wii and released in 2012. It uses the same engine from the Japanese exclusive 4th entry in the series, Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, meaning it uses an over-the-shoulder style camera instead of the original somewhat fixed perspective, which to be honest definitely loses some of that creepiness. That's not to say this remake isn't scary, because besides the redone cutscenes, visuals and camera, this is still the same old Project Zero 2 you know and love, or dread in this case. Taking photos of the spirits will always be such a tense experience. Naturally you want to stay away from these hauntings as much as possible, but the idea is that you need them to get up close so you can score the most damage when taking their picture. Just watching the ghosts lumbering towards you as you wait for the perfect shot is so nerve-wracking. There's also this Wii exclusive haunted house mode where you move around on rails and try not to get spooked by the randomly appearing ghosts. It's as dumb as it sounds. The most recent entry in the series, Maiden of Blackwater, is also pretty good and worth your time, even if the Wii U's gamepad controls can be a little infuriating. So if you have the choice of the two, I'd recommend Project Zero 2 on the Wii. Unless you live in Japan, then get Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, as that was written and directed by Suda51. Yes, that Suda51. Number 4, Silent Hill Shattered Memories. People don't tend to have positive things to say about the Silent Hill series after the original Japanese developers Team Silent disbanded in 2004. So in 2009, when Silent Hill Origins developers Climax Studios took another stab at the franchise with Shattered Memories, everyone was pleasantly surprised to find out that they had tried something new with the now stale series. It's a remake in a sense, as it has you play as Harry Mason losing his daughter Cheryl in the town Silent Hill after a car accident, but that's where the similarities end, as Shattered Memories is a wholly new beast. It's much more psychological horror than survival horror this time, right down to having psychotherapist sections dispersed in between intervals. Things you do in these sections can drastically change characters' appearances, and the environments you visit. Some are just cool palette swaps, but others can mess with your head. It's nicely implemented into the main game, which makes far better use of it than Until Dawn ever did. The game also uses the Wii Remote in some inventive ways to solve puzzles and act as your in-game phone. Whether that is taking pictures or receiving creepy voicemail messages through the remote speaker, Shattered Memories doesn't have combat like in previous Silent Hill games, but instead sees you running away from these fleshy creatures that chase you. These are definitely the worst sections of the game, but they're not as bad as some people make out. If anything, they're tense experiences that make you dread them every time they appear, which only adds some much needed horror. And besides, the way the world freezes over and shifts into the other world is a really unique and chilling effect. No pun intended. Okay, maybe a little. Number 3, Luigi's Mansion. It's the oldest game on this list, being that it was a GameCube launch title, and it's easily the most charming. Yes, obviously it isn't scary, but if there's one Nintendo game that evokes the Halloween spirit more than any other, it's Luigi's Mansion. Being only 4 hours long makes it the perfect game to play through on Halloween 2, which I annually do. The way you suck up ghosts with your vacuum is so cathartic, with you pulling back in the opposite direction to where they're desperately trying to claw away, as if you're reeling them in on a fishing rod. There's a satisfying element of skill in sucking them up, especially the sub-boss ghosts, which are oftentimes the highlights of the game. Like Melody, who quizzes you on past Mario tunes, or a personal favourite being the floating whirlinders, who literally share a heart while dancing. There's just something endearing about that. However, despite Luigi's Mansion's short length, it isn't without padding, as the last chapter sees you trek back and forth throughout the mansion for seemingly no reason, other than to artificially lengthen the game. That power outage can seriously go do one. As much as I enjoyed its sequel Luigi's Mansion 2, the first one is still the better game for me, with better pacing, more memorable bosses, and superior controls. If we ever do get Luigi's Mansion 3, I hope it sticks more to the formula of the first one. As for the music, once I start playing the game, I cannot stop whistling along with Luigi. It's just so catchy. Number 2, Eternal Darkness. If Luigi's Mansion was the result of Nintendo doing cutesy horror, then Eternal Darkness is the result of when they get serious and tackle full-on horror. It plays similar to that of an old-school Resident Evil game, minus the tank controls, as you take control of various characters throughout different time periods, but its unique selling point is now infamous sanity effects. You see, not only do you have to worry about your health meter, but you also have to keep an eye on your sanity meter too, as when it gets low the game will start messing with you. Some of the effects are a little on the nose, like entering a room and it being upside down or blood dripping from the walls, but others are way more subtle, like how a fly would just crawl across the screen, or how when saving, the game will pretend the memory card is corrupted. And as someone who has experienced this legitimately, many times because of dodgy third-party memory cards, this gets me every time. It truly is the king of psychological horror in games. And yet it isn't without its genuine scares too, which are oftentimes absolutely terrifying. The combat is also somewhat inventive, with you being able to target individual limbs on the enemies, so cutting off the head will leave them blind and unable to find you. Sure, the visuals aren't that impressive even for 2002, what with it originally being an N64 game early in development. It's just a crying shame that we may never see the deserved sequel. Well, we almost got one in the form of Shadow of the Eternals, a spiritual successor from the original creators of the Eternal Darkness, but I think it's back on track now, maybe? Maybe it's switched platforms? Come on Dennis Dyack, throw me a bone over here. Give us what we all want, please? Number 1, Resident Evil 4 Wii Edition. There are plenty of great Resident Evil games to choose from on Nintendo systems. There's Resident Evil 2 on the N64, the 2002 remake on the GameCube, and even Resident Evil Revelations on the 3DS and Wii U. But in my opinion, Resident Evil 4 is the best of the best, specifically the Wii port released in 2007. Why? Well, because the controls are so tight and it includes all of the extra bonus content seen in the PS2 version. I guess the bigger question is, what makes Resident Evil 4 so great? Well, you can do this, and this, and especially this. For better or for worse, it came at a time when survival horror games were growing stale, becoming dated and lacking originality. Resident Evil 4 didn't just change horror games, but it also rewrote the rules for third-person action games forever. Without RE4, we arguably wouldn't have games like Gears of War, and we certainly wouldn't have Dead Space. Unfortunately, because of how big of an influence RE4 had on the industry, it's now unfairly looked back on rather unfavourably amongst horror fans. And yet Resident Evil 4 isn't without its creepy moments. Its grimy Spanish setting is unsettling from the offset, which is made all the more unnerving with the natives shouting and pointing in a foreign language, even if the English dialogue is still the same level of Resident Evil cheese as ever. As much as I love the terrifying setting of the Resident Evil remake, or the goopy hauntings of Revelations, nothing quite beats the heart-pounding horror and infinite replayability of Resident Evil 4. So for this Halloween, what are you playing? Well, happy Halloween, and as always, thank you very much for watching. If you want to see more top 10s like this, then make sure you stay subscribed. And you can check out my last list that I did, which was on the top 10 Naughty Dog games. That's got a horror game in there if you want to watch it. Or you can also check out my gameplay channel, where I've just played a bunch of horror games, ranging from bad, which is like what you see on screen right now, to good, like Luigi's Mansion and Eternal Darkness, which I actually did with Alex. So yeah, you can give them a watch. And now I'm gonna go away from the microphone. Whoa.
Bye!